your host, Doreen Steenland, and today I'd like to welcome our guest, Dr. Aimee Apigian. How does one recognize unresolved stored trauma? How do we know that we're experiencing this?
That's a great question. And, when you ask that, the first thing that comes to my mind is everything that we've done wrong about trying to recognize trauma, which is we look for events in our past. And even as clinicians, that's kind of what we're trained to do. We're trained to ask questions for our patients. Like, did you have adverse childhood experiences? Did you have a sexual trauma? Did you have this? And it's this list of events that we go through. And that's actually not how we identify trauma, because actually what is trauma for one person could just be stress for another person. So it actually is not the event itself. It was the body's biochemical response during an event. So the body is having a response, and it's either having a stress response based on the physiology and the biology that's happening, or it's having a trauma response. The only way to know is to look at the biology, the physiology, the biochemistry that's happening. It's impossible to just look at the event itself and decide if that was a trauma for you or for someone else. We have to look at what's going on in the body. And so this has been a big misunderstanding around trauma, because of course, as I was taught in medical school, right? Like trauma is something that you go to therapy and talk about. And it definitely, I went to medical school at Loma Linda University, where they stress whole person care. Yes. And what that meant at that time was you talk about the emotional aspects of their disease. You talk about the spiritual aspects of their disease, and you send them to counseling, right? Like you send them to therapy, because this is an aspect that needs to be addressed. And yet what we find is that it's actually more about the trauma response in the body rather than in the brain. And if it were only in the brain, we could talk about it and resolve it. And yet, how many people have been in therapy for years, right? People who come through my program, just the 21-day journey program, which is where I start everyone. And they say, I have been in therapy for decades, for 20 years, for 30 years. And finally, by addressing the body component, I am seeing shifts that I haven't seen for years in talking about it. And so once we understand that, no, like trauma is the response that the body has in the physiology, it's not what happens up in our brain, then it gives us a whole different set of tools. So your question then around like, well, then how do we know, how do we recognize if there is stored trauma in the body? We're looking for those patterns, so that it doesn't matter when that response happened. And I want to call that response an overwhelming event, or an overwhelming situation where the body, the physiology was overwhelmed. That's what trauma is on a cellular level. And so when that happens, and if it's unresolved, it lingers. So that pattern of overwhelm in the physiology, in the biology, lingers. And so again, that response could have happened 20 years ago, but do I still see those patterns? Do I still see that biology playing out in a person's life? And there's 3 ways that I can recognize that. One would be their body sensations. And so for a person who wakes up, for example, and doesn't want to wake up, wishes that it weren't morning yet. Do I have to get up? I don't want to face my day. Their body just feels heavy. It feels exhausted. It feels tired. And sometimes they have to keep themselves caffeinated, or they have to keep themselves really stressed, or they multitask all day just to not get themselves ever in a place where they are relaxed. Because as soon as they're relaxed, they start to feel that heaviness and they start to feel that exhaustion. And so they keep themselves out of that by staying stressed and busy. And so that body sensation of just, I just feel heavy. And even like the posture can kind of go in, and you can recognize a shame posture where it's just like the shoulders are slumped and the head is down.
Sit up tall. Sorry.
Exactly. And we can force ourselves to sit up straight, but is that what the body would want to do? And so just recognizing, hey, like if your body could do anything, what would it want to do? And some people actually are able to tell me that if I could do anything, I would crawl back into bed right now, and I would just pull the covers over my head. Okay. So that is one way to recognize, you know what? Your body is still operating from this physiology of trauma. The other way to recognize it is a person's thoughts. And so the words that they say. So for someone who's coming into my programs, if they're saying things like, I just can't take it anymore. I can't do this anymore. It's just been too much for too long. It's overwhelming. Those are all words that only come when the body is in a trauma physiology state. It doesn't come when we're in a stress state. It doesn't come when we are in that parasympathetic state. Those are words that only come when the body is in the operating system of trauma. The last thing that we can look at to recognize is more for when a person has been chronically in this trauma physiology. And so there are moments of time when a body can go into a trauma response and then it comes out. But if we are now living just chronically in this place of the trauma physiology, now there are significant effects on our health. And you start to get physical symptoms, you start to get diseases, you start to get conditions, diagnoses even. And there's several that are clearly part of this trauma physiology. Those would be chronic pain. So any kind of chronic pain issues, those are all strongly associated with the body being in a trauma physiology. Autoimmunity, and there's a lot of different autoimmune conditions, any chronic inflammatory conditions really. And so that includes even things like diabetes, metabolic syndrome, obesity, all of these things that we've kind of put out there. Like, no, actually, those are all coming from the body chronically living in a trauma physiology. Things like chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, those are also conditions. So we can, GI symptoms, sleep issues, because when our physiology is one of trauma, that's the only outcome we can have. The only outcome we can have is the body getting sick. And it will often appear in multiple areas. It won't just be, I only have this. It'll be, well, I can't sleep well, I feel anxious, and my digestive system is off. It'll show up in multiple areas. And so that is the other way that we can recognize, the body has some unresolved trauma patterns that are still driving the physiology and making us sick.
So good. So I noticed a few things that I want to just highlight for our viewers.
Please.
The first thing I noticed was there seems to be a strong connection with the words you were using for people who are experiencing trauma and the symptoms of burnout.
Yes, very good.
Yeah.
Burnout is a trauma physiology.
Yes.
Yes, it is not stress. And that is actually part of what started my own journey, was that I got diagnosed with burnout and chronic stress. But I got so sick, got so burned out that I couldn't get out of bed for a period of time during my residency.
Yes.
Had to take a medical leave for a few months to figure things out because all of my labs appeared mostly normal. So we didn't even have a reason for the chronic fatigue. And I also got placed on 2 antidepressants because I was also struggling with the anxiety and the depression. And again, like just the way that our medical system is set up, it's siloed. And so you go see this person for that problem and this person for that problem, rather than one person being able to step back and say, you know what, all of these have one common root cause. Your body is in a trauma physiology, but the common understanding is still, oh, you're just stressed. You need to learn stress management. And so when we're misdiagnosing people with stress, when we should be diagnosing them with, no, your body is still in a trauma physiology, then we're giving them the wrong tools. And people then, of course, are not getting better. They may get back to a place of functioning and being able to get through their day, but they're definitely not back at that place of living with joy and purpose and meaning.
Yes. And so the answer for a lot of our viewers is to flee medicine, give up the career that they love, escape. And what I want to say is that may be an option for some people, but the symptoms are still going to travel with you.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
Until you address the underlying trauma, it's going to follow you wherever you go.
Wherever you go, there you are.
There you are. So let's just deal with it, right? Like, let's just deal with this once and for all and start developing tools that can help us manage what is happening inside. The other thing I noticed that you said is that often in medicine, we separate disease from the other things that are happening in our body. It's almost like there's a disconnect. Did I catch that right?
That's been my experience with most of medicine.
Yeah. Yeah. So I also noticed you say that really that stored energy is lodged in your body and it's kind of stuck there. And so what we have to do is learn how to move that energy out of your body and process it more effectively so that we can start functioning in a way that's more healthy for us.
Mm. Yeah, that's a good way to put it, because there is an energy to trauma.
Yes.
And actually what happens is that when we have stored trauma, we end up using a lot of energy
Mhm.
to keep it stuffed down
Yes.
because it feels overwhelming to let it surface. We feel like we're going to lose control. And so it
Yes.
requires a lot of energy to just get through our life when we have this unresolved trauma.
So good. And a lot of when you say stuffing down, those are the clients I see. They are numbing their emotions. They're over drinking, overeating, over scrolling, all of the overs. I call it the over and under syndrome, right? They're overdoing things in order to numb those feelings inside that they don't know how to deal with. And what I'm hearing you say is that there's a process that they could go through to actually work through this and help that stored energy just resolve.
Yeah. And I want to just stress how normal that is. Not
Yes.
necessarily healthy, right? But
Yeah.
how normal that is, because when we have these stored trauma patterns, like that really will be our only way to get through life, is some sort of coping mechanism, until we can have the space and the safety to start to look at how to address these trauma patterns. And so I don't want to label it as bad, because it's something that is not necessarily helping us be our best self, but it's helping us get through. And so we can appreciate, hey, like these coping mechanisms, which again, all the ones that you listed, I've done.
Yes.
And
Same.
they helped me get through a period
Yes.
of my life. And then it kind of reached a crucial point where it's like, I can't move forward in my life with these coping mechanisms. Like I will be kept at this level. I won't be able to grow anymore personally, professionally, if I'm still relying this much on these types of coping mechanisms.
Yeah.
But the process of letting those go and the process of moving the trauma energy is a very specific process. And so I don't ever want someone to hear me say, just go do some trauma work and you'll be fine. That is not the answer, because it depends on what trauma work you're going to do. There are therapies, there are modalities that are not the place to start. And when we start there, it actually makes things worse. And so the process by addressing trauma is just as important as actually addressing the trauma. So there's a specific order in which the body goes into a trauma response. And it's a very specific neurobiological step-by-step. This is what happens in this, and then we're in the trauma response. And so we have to honor that biology and work with it to reverse engineer it and say, all right, if this is where our physiology this is where we need to meet it in order to do this safely. And that is why most professionals don't end up doing this kind of work so far, is because they haven't known how to do it safely. And they do just a little bit, sometimes even just going to yoga. And even that feels like it just opens them up too much. And it doesn't feel safe, because now they're dealing with all these emotions that are coming up and they can't function. They can't get through their day. They can't meet their responsibilities with these emotions that feel overwhelming. And so they naturally go back to stuffing or distracting or masking, whatever they need to do to keep those at bay. And so the process, the methods that they're using are so essential to be able to do this in a safe way so that they don't fall apart in the process of doing trauma work. There is an essential sequence to doing trauma work.
Good. Okay. So you mentioned that there are some things that could actually set you back.
Oh, totally.
What
I
might
think I've
those
done most
things
of them.
be? Like, let's just put them out there.
Yeah.
That if you do these things in the wrong order, it could set you back. So what
Yeah.
might those things be for our viewers?
Anything that processes trauma.
Okay.
So when you think of, I don't know, just kind of your traditional counseling or therapy where you go in and you talk about something in order to process it, or you go into other modalities where you do these deep dives into something to process trauma, or, you know, like psychedelics and this is big window into processing stuff. There actually is a first required foundational step before your body is able and ready to safely process trauma. And when we try to process that trauma without this foundation, that's when things fall apart. We have to have that foundation in place. The foundation is something called regulation. So regulation refers to homeostasis for those of your audience that are medical professionals and will relate to that word. Homeostasis is this idea in our biology and our physiology that things are manageable, that things are within our window of tolerance.
Yes.
So that even when there's a little bit of stress, it's not going into the high stress that I can't feel like I can manage this. It's our body's ability to regulate itself. That's the same thing with emotions and body sensations. And so as things come up, if they feel overwhelming, if they feel too big for us, then we've lost our regulation, we've lost our window of tolerance, and there we go. And we actually re-traumatize ourselves in the process. We put our body right back into that trauma response we're supposed to be trying to heal.
Yeah.
And so when we are doing this work, we need to do it in a way that we're not overwhelming our bodies, that we're not putting our bodies back into this trauma place, because that just reinforces that this is what we do. We go into the trauma physiology. And so we have to do things very differently than how we've done things before. So anything that processes trauma, anything, any modality, I want to even say EMDR, right? Like these modalities where we're processing things, they require a foundation of regulation. And I think of it, I related it to your capacity. And so a person's capacity for emotional states, for example. And what's your current capacity? I think of it like a mug, right? Like you can pour your coffee in the morning into your mug. Well, how big is your mug? How much coffee can your mug hold? Because if you just keep pouring, it's going to spill over and make a big mess. And that's what we do to our bodies when we go to do trauma work so many times, is we just keep overflowing, keep pouring more in. Like we can do this. We've got this. We should be able to do this. And then it's spilling all over and making a big mess in our lives. We're more reactive. We're more sensitive. We shut back down and we've opened up too much too fast and re-traumatized ourselves in the process. So rather we look at our mug and we say, all right, my mug is pretty small to begin with. And that's all that my body can handle right now. So I'm going to learn tools to make my mug bigger and bigger and bigger, so that then I can go in and I can do some work around processing trauma, and my mug is big enough to hold that. As long as my mug is small, it doesn't have the capacity for that. Processing trauma is a stress on the body. Yes. Right. It's like running a race. It's like running. Are you going to run a 5K? Are you going to run a 13K? You're going to, run a marathon. Well, I don't know. How big is your mug? Right? How much stress can your body handle? Even though it's good stress, it is still stress. And so we have to actually build in this regulation piece first. So that's where I start people. And it's fascinating to see that, most of the people that come to me are those who have some kind of physical health condition, whether they're not sleeping well, they've got some GI issues, they've got chronic fatigue, they have autoimmunity. They're finally starting to recognize the association that has with unresolved trauma. And they're like, all right, I guess I need to do trauma work, and I haven't been doing it the right way. And so they come in and I take them through 21 days of learning how to regulate their system, so that I'm giving them tools to make their mug bigger and bigger and bigger. Just in that process of building their regulation, they are experiencing significant changes in their physical health by the end of the 21 days. So that I've now started to collect the data, 26% decrease in daily physical pain.
That's awesome.
28% decrease in GI symptoms. in sleep issues, 30% decrease in depression and anxiety. And I haven't even done anything yet. I haven't even talked to them about supplements or a different diet for their GI symptoms. I haven't talked to them about sleep habits yet. I have not done anything other than teach them a very short, very basic somatic exercise that teaches them how to regulate their nervous system and start to make their cup bigger. And just in that process, their trauma physiology is already starting to change, so that by the end of that 21 days, now they are more ready to do processing of trauma. But a person has to build the regulation first. And that's been a critical piece missing in trauma work.
Agreed. I can't agree more. Okay, so what predisposes us to be the type of person that is more susceptible to this trauma, right? Because you're saying it's a response and it doesn't necessarily have to be an event. So what in us makes us more susceptible to that?
Yeah, and this is fascinating, because when we can see that trauma really is our biology, then we look at, well, is there a gene then for trauma, right? Like, is there a gene for these other diseases? And the answer is no, there's no gene, but the state of our body, the state of our biology going into life, going into situations, going into an event is more important to decide whether we will come out of that having had a trauma response or not than the event itself. So it's the state that we are going into that event more than the event itself. And so we look at what are those things that might make us more resilient, and what are those things that might make us more sensitive and more vulnerable. And there are things that make us more vulnerable. For example, if we already have high amounts of oxidative stress in our cells, again, our cells are already dealing with so much stress. This is oxidative stress, but it's still stress. And so it can only handle so much more stress before it says, hey, we can't do this anymore. And we're going into a trauma physiology. And so what are those things that cause more internal stress? Oxidative stress, inflammation, and poor neurotransmitters. So if we have biochemical imbalances that are causing low serotonin activity, low dopamine activity, these are things that will make a person more sensitive, more vulnerable to being overwhelmed by everyday life experiences. I even want to think of a biochemical imbalance called pyroluria. This is something that will cause a functional deficiency in zinc and B6. And those are two nutrients that really protect the nervous system and the nerves. And so without that protection, or without as much of protection, the nerves are like sitting there raw. I want to think of it as just that raw nerve fiber. And so anytime that you touch a raw nerve, like it just, like it super reacts. And so anything can happen. Now, these people who have pyroluria are very sensitive to bright lights, to loud noises. They are sensitive to sensory stimulus. And yet, isn't that our world, right? Like, just we go outside and there's a bright light called the sun. I mean, our world is full of sensory information coming in. And so if these people are already walking around stressed because their system is more sensitive, it won't take that much more to just push their system into overwhelm and into that trauma response. It could be something that someone says. It could be something that someone doesn't say, but they wanted them to say. It can be anything, right? Like the smallest thing, because their system is going into their day, into life, already vulnerable, already sensitive. And so it doesn't take that much more to top them over that line into the trauma response.
Wow. So as you're talking, my brain just went someplace else, and I might throw you a curveball here, but I'm going to just, and if you don't want to talk about this, just bypass it. But the connection I made is, wow, could that be a problem for those who are labeled as highly sensitive people? Right?
Yeah. So I actually have a whole section on this in my biology of trauma training for professionals, because many professionals end up being highly sensitive people, empaths.
Yeah.
And even this idea around being wounded healers.
Yes.
And yes, this is the biology underneath that surface. You're exactly right.
Yeah.
And so in my chapters, I lay out exactly what are those biochemical, biological changes that make them more sensitive, and how can we actually support those so that now they are more resilient, and yet they can use that sensitivity now for a gift and for developing their intuition rather than just being overwhelmed by
Yeah.
people, by life, by everything, because there's so much that we can do. And, I think of so many people, myself included, who were kind of labeled as being, oh, she's the emotional child, she's the sensitive
Yes.
one, right? And realizing now that, hey, that was just my biochemistry, and that there is so much that could have been done. And now that I do now in order to change that, in order to support that, so that I'm going into my day so much more resourced on a cellular level. I am resourced, and I'm not going in being sensitive and reactive and having to guard myself against everything because everything feels overwhelming. And that's the same thing with boundaries, right? Like when we don't feel that we have good boundaries from people, it's because we don't have the energy, we don't have the resources to keep those boundaries up. Well, everything is coming in, everything feels overwhelming, and we tend to be more sensitive. So all of that is actually a trauma response that's happening, and there's a biology underneath that we can support.
Awesome. Okay. One last question, because I could talk to you all day about this, but we have to maintain our 30 minutes. What is the true root cause of trauma, in your opinion?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's we need to talk about that, right? Like, so rather than just talking about trauma, we really need to look at and what causes trauma then. Like what is that? And there's two triggers for the trauma response in the body. And when we look at it through this lens, we can look back on our life very differently. And we can identify, oh, yeah, that would have been a trauma for me. And I never saw it in that light.
Mm.
So the two triggers are something comes at us too much, too fast.
Mm.
Or the other trigger is too little of something for just too long. Too little of love, too little of touch, too little of support, too little of nutritious food, too little of magnesium, too little of something essential, something that I need. I need this. This is not just a want. I need this. And I've had to live on too little of it for just too long. I can't do it anymore.
Wow.
So those are your two triggers for the trauma response. And so we can look back at our life and say, when did things feel too much, too fast? Like, oh, it just felt like everything came at me at once, or there were too many deaths all in a row that I didn't have time to process everything that was happening.
Yeah.
Everything that happens to us, we're supposed to be able to process, digest, and integrate. And when things happen too fast, we can't process it all. And so we've got to just be like, all right, I'm going to stuff you down until I have time to process you.
Yes.
And then we can look at the too little for too long. And many times by the time people come to me, it's a combination of both, right? They've had both too much, too fast, and too little of too long. And we're looking at decades of this.
Yes. And as you're talking about too much, too fast, I was thinking of our pandemic that we've just experienced, and healthcare providers being bombarded, especially, I keep saying that we were in the New York metro area. That's where I live. And our area was bombarded with the first wave. And we didn't know how to care for these patients. And it was too much, too fast. It was constant death, death, death. And that is a trauma response, according to what you're saying. And I think that many of our professionals are still walking around in survival mode,
Totally.
in chronic trauma response.